Okay, I'm here after school by myself to talk a little bit and intro Wuthering Heights. Don't need to wear the mask when I'm alone. Wuthering Heights takes place is a frame narrative, so we have to remember that as the book opens in the year 1801. Lockwood is our narrator. He is coming to North Yorkshire, upper part, upper eastern part of England, to rent Thrushcross Grange. It is an old English manor home. He is opening the book by visiting his landlord at Wuthering Heights, the neighboring estate. These estates in the past were owned by two separate families. Wuthering Heights was owned by the Earnshaw family. Thrushcross Grange was owned by the Linton family. When we do get into Nellie Dean's narration of, hey, what happened to these families in the past? We begin with Heathcliff's generation as children. And so Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw are alive and parents. Mr. and Mrs. Linton are parents. They each have two biological children. The Earnshaws have an older son, Henley, and a younger daughter, Catherine. Rough estimates for years, Henley Earnshaw would be born about 1757, Catherine Earnshaw about 1765. Here at Thrushcross Grange, they have two children. Edgar Linton is born about 1762. He has a younger sister. Isabella Linton is born about 1765. And so you notice we have older males, younger female siblings. Actually, they should be closer in whatever. We get that. What we find as the book goes on is that this generation will begin to marry. Henley Earnshaw will go off to school. He will return with a wife. They will produce a child. That child's name is Hareton Earnshaw. He'll be born about 1778. Henley's wife's name is, oh goodness, why do I not have it written on this card? Henley's wife's name is really kind of inconsequential because she's going to die pretty quickly. She just comes into the book more or less to birth this child. So it'll probably come to me while we're doing this. Catherine will marry Edgar Linton, and they will have a daughter. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Their daughter's name will be Catherine as well. For convention and understanding and clarity with discussions of this novel, we will refer to the elder as Catherine, the younger as Kathy. The book will more or less follow that same ideal as well. So again, Catherine is the elder. Her daughter's name is Kathy. We do have a specific date for this. She is born March 20th. Of 1784, the book will note that it is a major turning point when she is born because of the nature of this novel. There is one character in this first generation that is not on the board yet, and that is the eventual owner of Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is a name unto himself. He has no surname or last name. He is an orphan found by Mr. Earnshaw during a trip to London and brought back to this manor home. In previous years, the Earnshaws had lost a third child in infancy. And so they see Heathcliff as a gift from God. They give this child, this boy, this urchin, the dead child's name, but they do not give him their surname of Earnshaw. And so Heathcliff exists completely of himself. He will be raised here in this household, and he will be very close to Catherine. Catherine ultimately will choose to marry Edgar, and that will be a contentious issue within the narrative and that first couple of sections that we will read. Heathcliff will eventually, though, marry Isabella more out of revenge than anything else, and they will have a child together. And here's where it gets fun. They will name this child Linton. But because Heathcliff has no surname or last name, his name functions as both. And so this child will be named Linton Heathcliff. Yeah, as if we couldn't get any more confusing. Linton Heathcliff will be born roughly in 1784 as well. Heathcliff, we can guess he's probably born about 1764. If we're trying to figure out how old he is, he's roughly similarly aged to Catherine Earnshaw. So in looking at this kind of family structure, it's important to note for a few reasons. One, you notice the alignment of houses. And as we go through the book, where, these houses will be characterized by the people that live in them. And as the book goes on, we will start to see characters move from one house to another. And when that happens, you will notice that their natural tendencies don't work anymore. They are suited for where they were birthed. And often when they move to a different house, we see issues that progress. We also will see as this book goes on that it is a book of generations. We see generation one take up the first half of the book, our first two reading assignments. And then generation two will become the focus of the second half of the book. And all will revolve here around Heathcliff. Of course, he is the eventual owner of Wuthering Heights here in 1801 when we open the book. And it poses a very troubling question as we find out more. How does Heathcliff, an orphan with no surname and really no right to land ownership in 1800s England, end up owning not just one home, but two? And that will be the driving force behind this. My suggestion, much like I have here, make yourself a little note card with this and keep it close to you. Not so much for the years, not so much for some of those things, but just to keep track of certain things. You'll notice lots of H names as we get going. You'll notice that Catherine, Kathy thing. It's just easier to be able to see who these people are as we get started for clarity's sake. And just to remember who they are and how they fit in. With that in mind, we do have some other really just one other character, a couple other characters we want to mention. So we're going to put them over here. Lockwood will narrate the stuff in the present in 1801, but he will look to Nellie Dean, who is a maid, to kind of narrate for him this history of these two families and these two houses. And so Lockwood will be narrator one and Nellie Dean will be narrator two. But you notice that with both narrators, neither is directly involved in any of this action. Nellie Dean is roughly the same age as Hindley Earnshaw. And so she comes of age in these houses. She's an observer. We will talk a lot about her narrative voice because Nellie Dean often will present herself in ways that aren't appropriate for the time period. Think about for you as a person, when you retell a story about yourself, often you may exaggerate details. You may change what you say because you now figure out the better way to say it. And often we see Nellie Dean speak to characters in this book in a way that socially is not acceptable, given that she is of lower class. She's a servant in their home. So we will ask those questions of how reliable of a narrator is Nellie Dean in presenting this. We will also see Joseph mentioned. He is an older servant. He is an adult when they are children. Joseph speaks in dialect. And so this northern Yorkshire area of England it's closer to Scotland. And so if you're familiar with Groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons, if you can affect that kind of voice when you read Joseph and read his lines out loud, a lot of times they make a lot more sense. Most versions of the book anymore do include a gloss of all of Joseph's lines. They're all translated into pretty simple English. So if you're confused, check to see if your book has that. And if not, look online. Guarantee you'll find it really quickly. Joseph will often represent religion, and we'll discuss why and how as the book progresses a bit. One other thing to keep in mind with how this book is structured is the two formats that it plays on. First, this is a Gothic novel. When we discuss Gothic elements in a little bit, we will give you the chance to read before we start to tell you, hey, what are some of those Gothic conventions? Gothic literature comes out of Europe, eventually becomes an American thing as well, but it's kind of founded on these old manor homes that, by 1800s are starting to fall apart. They used to be these beautiful, pristine castles and these huge places, but because of the upkeep, because of the stonework, because of the weather of England and Europe, they start to deteriorate and fall apart, and they become prime places for creepy stories to take place. Gothic traditions show that nothing is nice and new and good. And this permeates this novel, not just in terms of the setting, but in terms of the characters themselves. They are not always good people, they don't always make good choices. And there's a lot wrong with them. We'll talk a lot about this Gothic ideal because what Bronte is able to do is mix it with romanticism. And when we talk about romantic literature, we're not talking about those kind of like love novels that you would see at Target with the shirtless guy and the girl who's impossibly arching back in his arms, but rather the movement to romanticize nature and to show the human connection with it. And this novel definitely will do that. It will use the moors, this geographical setting in Europe that is part swamp, part grassland, kind of mixed together, to talk about the harsh nature of life in Yorkshire and reflected in the characters that are produced. And so this Gothic romanticism really is very different and sets the book apart for its voice and structure. Hopefully, this helps you to see sort of characters we're dealing with and situations that you need to know as we get started.